Hi and welcome to the third in my series of videos that draws a link between the 1 to 60 content now and how it was originally in Vanilla World of Warcraft. This is going to be on the Scholomance, and this is a little different to the first two in the series. By the way, if you haven't seen the first two in the series, I've put a link down there to the playlist where you can get access to all of these. The Scholomance has had a complete rework. It's one of the dungeons that has been completely redone. So I'll be referring to some aspects that you only get a little peek into, which is a little bit different to the first two that I've already done. So the Scholomance itself is a school of necromancy. It's located in Caer Darrow, a little island in the middle of this lake. And looking around here, little ghosts of the people who used to inhabit this little area. But if you went there, would you see these spirits yourself? Going to the same location on my mage that I've only just leveled to 100, I don't see them at all. So what's going on? Is it these cool goggles I've got on my paladin that lets me see them? No, it's actually this trinket that came from a quest based on the Scholomance from vanilla times that you can't do anymore. This spirit is the only one that everyone can see now because it sells patterns to things that alchemists need and blacksmiths as well. But all the other spirits around this little area that I can see with this trinket on, you won't actually be able to see without it. So the majority of people won't actually be able to see them. Now the first aspect of the dungeon itself was this door. Many of you may never have seen it, of course, because what we do now is queue up for LFD and we get ported straight into the dungeon. But even if you do go there now, all you have to do is to open it is to click on it. At the time, though, it needed a key, like a lot of things did. To obtain that key was not just going into a dungeon, like the previous ones I've discussed. This involved a reasonably lengthy quest chain that took you as far afield as Ungoro Crater in the western part and Kalimdor, and culminated in having to defeat a lich in an area not far from here in Western Plaguelands. Not that many people had the key, especially in the early days, so when you were forming a group, you needed someone with the key to be in the group, or at least to let you in. You could open it yourself from the other side, though. So as soon as you got someone in from the other side, they could pull a lever and let everyone else in. The first place we come into is this landing area. At the moment there's nothing down there because that is where Dandling and Lillian Voss encounter is. But what used to be there was like exploding ghouls and zombies. And if you weren't very careful, you could accidentally hit one and then have them all charging up at you. So you had to be a little bit careful here. Here is a screenshot of, well, not a lot. There used to be a trash pack down there, though, with a mixture of undead and humans, which used to need crowd control. You had to be very careful with this. This could easily wipe you, especially in the sort of gear that would need upgrades from this dungeon. So just a little bit of a lament at the times when you didn't just have a tank rush straight into trash packs, AoE them down. You used to consider it very carefully. If you had a priest, you would probably crowd control one of the undead. If you had a mage, you'd sheep one of the humanoids or a rogue and sap them and so on. So you only had to pull a couple and you'd pull them back up these stairs to avoid aggroing any of the wandering patrols. How times have changed. Now, the first boss wasn't really a boss at all. The Blood Steward of Kurtanos, and in fact wasn't actually included right at the start in the Scholomance, but was added fairly early on, as far as I recall. She didn't drop any loot as such, and of course in a loot-driven game, that means most people would avoid her. She was a bit of a pain in the arse to kill, because you would have to clear the whole of the first room. The only real reasons people would ever want to clear the first room was to get access to one of the tomes for the quest. We still have a very similar quest now. She dropped something called Blood of Innocence, and there'll be more on that in a moment. Now, the next boss you come to in the reworked version is Alexei Bharath. Now, before I talk about her, I did have a little bit of a debate to myself into which order to do things. Because this dungeon has been reworked, it's not just that bosses have changed and loot tables have changed and quests have changed. The actual architecture has changed. Originally, you would not have come through this way. You would have gone into the room where Rattle Gor now appears, and Rattle Gor himself was in a completely different room. So this, to avoid confusion, I'm going to go through it in the order that you can go through now and just point out various features. So when eventually you went into the room where Jandis Bharath was, which you can't get through the normal way now, so they've just plonked this bit in here. She worked pretty much as before. She was a little less corporeal then, but she's still undead. She still split up into mirror images of herself. You still had to attack her rather than the mirror images to actually get the fight over with. She was quite a nasty fight. She was a completely optional boss, one that wasn't run very often. Now, I'm going to caution here because a couple of people mentioned on my Diamol one. When I say that, I'm talking about the experience I had with pug groups on my realm. She was very rarely done. She was a bit out of the way. She certainly wasn't on your way to anywhere. Now, in the room she was a lever. You could pull this lever and it would actually open up a little secret area to a chest where you might have a few green items. This is now the area that automatically opens up when you defeat the Lillian Voss encounter, but it is in the same room and it's the same basic feature. The room where Rattle Gor now appears was just a room of trash packs before. It was the same sort of trash packs we've got now. In a much later patch in Vanilla, they were added to drop dark runes, which were used for various things, but were useful for raiding. So you could sell these for quite a lot on the auction house if you were just dungeon running. And it also led to the right to a little area that's closed off to us now, but you used to have a summonable boss there called Kurtanos the Herald. Now this links back to that first boss that I talked about, the Blood Steward of Kurtanos. You needed something called Blood of Innocence to summon him. There was a little brazier, which isn't there now, and he'd come flying in. It was a little gargoyle thing, turned into a humanoid. You'd beat him up. He was actually a really tough fight. He dropped some useful things. One of the things he dropped was a male intellect braces called Loomguard arm braces. I still remember now. I've not even had to look that up because I used them when I was healing on my paladin all the way through Nax, really Nax. All the way through Vanilla up until Nax when I actually managed to upgrade them to better healing braces. They were absolutely awesome. Now, although he was an optional boss, if anyone happened to have any Blood of Innocence on them, people would run it because it had really nice gear. It's just that most people would not kill that first Blood Steward of Kurtanos for the blood because it wasn't then deemed worth it having to clear all that trash. Now, I don't want to talk too much about trash, otherwise this video will end up longer than it's already going to be. But this room is completely different again. I mean, all the rooms are largely different. There used to be a table just here. I remember it very distinctly because behind the table was some ghost trash. You used to find these in a few other parts of the room as well. This was particularly nasty because what would happen is a couple of the ghosts would sort of disappear and nothing you could do about it. And then they'd suddenly reappear on someone else and curse them and do quite a lot of damage. So again, it was another thing you'd generally want to pull back. Quite nasty trash. So rather than ghosts and the casters, the necromancers that used to exist at the time, we've now got mobs called Krastinovian Carvers. This is a homage to a boss that is no longer in, called Krastinov the Butcher. Very popular boss, a very nasty boss. And he was also involved in a quest chain, and he dropped Blood of the Innocent. So what some people would sometimes do is you'd run through the dungeon, you kill the Butcher, you might get Blood of the Innocents. If you'd done the quest, if you hadn't done the quest, I don't think it dropped. I'm not 100% on that. And then you'd have it for the next time because it was people generally didn't go back to do Kurtanos the Herald. Again, that's my recollection. So this is the door that originally led to Jandis Bharath. This is the door that originally led to Rattle Gor. First room was some necromancers with some plagued whelps. They were involved in a quest. And then you went through this wooden door you can just see there, and that took you down into something called the Ossuary. That's where Rattle Gor was, as well as a load of bone golem mobs. Now, this is where paladins came into their own. I was really useful at this point. because you'd need to pull a few of these bone golems out because they were very hard hitting. You didn't want to get multiple ones, especially when you were doing it as 5-man. You could raid this dungeon originally as 10-man, and that's what a lot of people did to get gear, to gear up, because it was bloody tough, at least until they nerfed it, but that didn't happen until much later. And being a paladin, I was able to sense undead. This allowed me to track undead on my minimap. I could also pull. I actually was able to pull because exorcism was only usable on undead and demons, so very rarely was it useful. So we generally didn't have a ranged ability unless we had Lincoln's boomerang. More on that in another video. But what we could do was pull a few out, and then we'd kill those down. Then we'd pull Rattle Gor out himself. Rattle Gor again was really tough. Generally speaking, the room would not be cleared. However, this particular room was used for the final encounter of the Paladin Charger quest. That's for our epic mount. But again, more on that in another video. So this is the secret chest that is now a loot chest when you defeat the Lillian Voss encounter. But the portcullis only used to raise when you opened, or when you pressed the lever, in Alexei Bharath's room, who again, as I said, was out of the way optional boss. This room's changed a bit. The railings and so on are newly added, but it was always a room of students. They were not hostile to begin with. They were neutral unless you aggroed them or had a quest item that made them all hostile. Up here were a couple of mobs that you could they were like optional bosses. They could drop scourge stones, no real loot as far as I remember. I think there was a rare chance of dropping something reasonable. Here we have a door, which again we can't go through. This led to Ras Frostwhisper, who was a lich. He oversaw the undead in the Scholomance. Again, it was although, I mean, we talk about optional bosses, of course, almost all bosses were optional. But people generally did do this boss. It dropped really good loot. It was a really nice boss fight. Out of all the boss fights in this dungeon, it was probably the most bossy of boss fights. It had more mechanics. The other thing it had of interest was something called an alchemy bench. Now, in those days, to make flasks, you needed to be at an alchemy bench. You couldn't just craft them wherever you liked. It also has to be noted that the use of flasks was not as common in raiding as it is now. In fact, if I can just put on my rose-tinted glasses a little bit and try and remember. I recall the first time I came across flasks. We were doing Molten Core. I wasn't a raid leader at the time. And we were doing Ragnaros, getting our asses kicked. And then one day, the raid leader said, "Next raid, we are going to kill this boss." And we were thinking, we're nowhere near, what you on about? And he said, "No, we're killing it next time." And we all just thought he was mad. And then the next time, unbeknownst to us, he'd got a little posse. And he was handing out a load of flasks. And wouldn't you know it, we killed it. The power of these things was enormous. Obviously, you're used to now people being expected to use flasks in organised raiding. They're very easy to get. At the time, they were not easy to get. They needed a component called Black Lotus. This was a rare herb spawn. There were spawn points where you'd expect to find it, but it was still rare to come across. It was very expensive. And you needed to get a group with an alchemist who had the pattern, and the pattern was no easy thing to get as well for the different flasks, into the Scholomance to use the alchemy bench. There was one other alchemy bench, but that was in Blackwing Lair, and if you were still in Molten Core, that was a little bit tricky to get to. So on to the final area for both the new version of Scholomance and the old one, where you'd find Dark Master Dandling. Except in the old one, you didn't find Dark Master Dandling. He wasn't there at all. He appeared much later. There were a series of rooms. You can still see these rooms now, these rooms on the upstairs and the downstairs. The purpose they serve now, as they did then, is on the Dandling fight, if it lasts long enough, he may teleport one of your party members to one of these rooms, where there are some low health mobs you have to defeat, get to the other end, get out the door, back into the encounter. But at the time, the doors were open, and they all had mini bosses in them. They generally didn't drop any good loot. There were a couple of exceptions. Some of the bosses were harder than others. I'm not going to go through all the bosses. I will go through a few honourable mentions though. But the idea was you had to defeat each of these bosses before you could get Dandling to appear. Different groups would tackle this in different ways. Some of them would generally do the downstairs first, of course, so that when you finish the last one on the upstairs, where Dandling appeared, he still appears where he is now. You didn't walk out straight into him. You had time to prepare. Now, one of those honourable mentions would be the Ravenian, who was one of the bosses, mini-bosses on the downstairs. To your right, as you face Dandling, as I recall. He was notable because he had a couple of mechanics that would be useful for training you up for doing more difficult dungeons. Not that they came much more difficult than this at the time. And raiding. But also because he dropped something called, or had the chance to drop something called the Ancient Bone Bow, which was highly desirable in the hands of not just hunters, but also rogues as well because of the agility on it. The other notable mini-boss was Alexei Bharath. He was the original owner of the Scholomance until he handed it over to the Scourge for use as a school of necromancy. He was also notable for being a very tough mini-boss. And it's his sons that would set you on the quest to get the 4 deeds of the Scholomance in the original version. There is a very similar quest now. And you would either be sent by Weldon on the Horde side, I believe, and Alexei on the Alliance side. It culminated in a little bit of PvP in the Plague Lens, whereupon you got the trinket, the Bharath Peasant Caller. The Butcher, as mentioned earlier, was also one of these compulsory mini-bosses necessary to summon Dandling. And then Dandling would appear, he'd call out, "School is in session," and then you'd all meet up round about here to get yourself ready. Dandling then does what Dandling does now, as far as I can recall before I was one-shotting him. He will occasionally summon in mobs. He will occasionally teleport one of you to a room. You have to kill little mobs from the mini-boss rooms, get to the other side and get back out. They weren't too bad. Even if a healer got teleported, it wasn't actually a disaster. You would usually need to get out quite quickly, though. The fight was not necessarily a fast one. He dropped dungeon tier helms. Back in those days, there were dungeon tier sets you would get with little set bonuses, blue sets, before you'd go into raiding. This one dropped the helm. This instance actually was my favourite, which is just as well because it took a long time. I was actually counting, I forget now though, but it was over 40 kills before I even saw the Lightforge helm drop. And even that wasn't the last bit of my set. but I did used to enjoy this dungeon a lot. There were a few other mini-bosses I'm not going to go through because they're not apparent, and this series is all about things that are apparent from what you can see. I have gone a little bit beyond the looking glass compared with what I'd normally do, but that is simply because this dungeon has been heavily reworked, completely redone since then, so I felt that I did need to do that. So thanks very much for sticking through this. If you've liked it, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And if you don't like it, don't forget to comment. And there'll be new ones each week. I've got quite a lot planned for the series. So until next time, I'll see you later.